In the summer of 1971, 4-year-old Emily Adams was standing on the front porch of her home in a quiet neighborhood in Tennessee where kids often played without locked doors. Just minutes later, Emily vanished. No cries for help, no drag marks, no one clearly saw what happened. Police searched for months, then years, before the case was closed with a cold conclusion: the child had likely died. Her family learned to live on with a room that was never cleared out, with memories of a little girl forever frozen at age 4. Meanwhile, somewhere else, Emily grew up normally, under a different name, a different history, unaware that she had once been buried in the files of a cold case. And then, nearly half a century later, a string of soulless data revived the question that time seemed to have erased: if Emily never died, then who took her, and what did an entire system miss for those 49 years? Before we dive deeper into this shocking true story, let us know where you're watching from, and if you love journeys into forgotten justice, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the next part. In 1971, Tennessee still had the feel of a slow-paced American South, where small neighborhoods operated on familiarity and mutual trust. Children played in front yards with rarely an adult watching. Doors were often left unlocked during the day, and the concept of stranger danger hadn't yet become the constant obsession it would in later decades. In a quiet Chattanooga neighborhood, the Adams family lived a life no different from their neighbors. A working-class family with a steady routine, the father working fixed shifts, the mother staying home to manage the household, meals on schedule, weekends for relatives and church, no history of violence, no public conflicts, no attention from any agency or organization. Emily Adams, the youngest daughter in the family, 4 years old, small for her age, with light-colored hair often tied back neatly, was a gentle child, trusting and familiar with being called by name, by adults in the neighborhood, accustomed to playing around the yard or staying within sight of family, often carrying a small item with her as an unconscious habit, and taught simple rules suited to the era like not going too far, but never prepared for the worst-case scenario. That morning started like any other household activities proceeding normally. Emily seen playing in her familiar area, under the intermittent attention of a family member who was doing chores while keeping an eye on her, supervision that was more trust-based than controlling, and it was in that context that a small detail appeared, which no one immediately saw as dangerous. The presence of a stranger or an element outside the usual daily rhythm, not noisy, no violent actions, just enough to create a fleeting sense of oddness, causing the main witness, the person with the closest and most direct connection to Emily at that moment, to hesitate in reacting, reassuring themselves that nothing was wrong, that this was just a normal moment in a normal day. The initial danger signals, in hindsight, could be pieced together into a chain of warnings, but at the time they existed in isolation, not strong enough to prompt decisive action, and the period Emily was out of supervision was so short that no one noticed right away. No clear screams, no signs of chaos, just a gap that appeared between two glances. The mistake leading to the disappearance wasn't a major decision, but the accumulation of very ordinary limitations: believing the neighborhood was safe, believing a few minutes was enough, believing a child familiar with the surroundings wouldn't wander far. And when the Adams family began searching Emily nearby, the initial feeling was confusion more than fear, calling her name around the house, checking familiar spots, quickly asking those nearby. While the information received was vague, no one sure what they had seen, or when, answers lacking, time anchors causing anxiety to build with each passing minute. The realization that Emily was no longer where she should be became clearer, and with it came spreading panic in the family, a sense of losing control as all spontaneous efforts yielded no results, forcing them to make a decision no one had imagined on a peaceful morning: contact the police, officially report that Emily Adams had disappeared, an action marking the moment a normal day ended, and opened a chain of events stretching decades, though in that instant, no one in the family could foresee the true consequences of the brief time Emily was out of adult sight. The Adams family's missing person call was received in a context where child disappearances were still considered rare, so from the very first step, information was recorded under standard procedure for a missing child case, including time of discovery, residence address, age, basic description, and last known circumstances all collected, while the reporter was in a state of panic, speech fragmented, and unable to organize timelines coherently. After a quick urgency assessment, the case was classified as a disappearance with risk factors due to the victim's young age and short unexplained absence, leading to activation of the local police's 1971 initial response protocol, prioritizing arrival at the scene as soon as possible to prevent further disturbance. Police units were dispatched to the Adams home quickly, making direct contact with parents and the main witness, while beginning to establish minimal control around the house and nearest exits. Though scene lockdown concepts at that time weren't as strict as later, but efforts were made to limit casual foot traffic in the area. Approaching the scene revealed no clear signs of a typical emergency, no recorded cries for help, no visible damage, no chaos. This very normality, making situation assessment harder, as it didn't fit common images of a violent abduction. Alongside area control, police began taking initial statements from family members and those present near the disappearance time, and right in this phase, the first gaps in the story emerged, not from deliberate concealment, but natural memory limits under shock. The last sighting time of Emily couldn't be pinned exactly to minutes, activities before and after blurred together, each person recalling different details, but no one grasping the full picture. The main witness, closest to Emily, before she vanished, provided information with much hesitation, descriptions more guessed than confirmed, reflecting the earlier indecision, extending into police interactions, while neighbors offered only scattered observations, inconsistent in time and space, complicating event sequencing. The Adams family, emotionally distraught, tried cooperating, while unconsciously adding or adjusting their accounts upon hearing others, creating small differences enough for investigators to note inconsistencies, not as evidence of deceit, but signs of psychological shock distorting accurate recall. Area containment expanded basically, focusing on nearby roads, paths a 4-year-old could reach or be taken quickly, but with time passed since Emily left supervision, police couldn't pinpoint a clear starting point for hypothetical routes, making all directions speculative. Meanwhile, initial protocol required quickly establishing a preliminary timeline, but collected timestamps overlapped constantly, with unfilled gaps, these gaps dominating the early investigation phase, forcing reliance on assumptions over evidence. Case classification, though prioritized high, was influenced by era's thinking, where stranger abduction wasn't the most common scenario, making initial information gathering cautious, but not aggressive enough to early rule out alternatives. In these first hours, investigation unfolded, amid lacking solid info, scene offering no clear signs, statements full of gaps, family and witnesses, psychologically unstable, creating a fragile foundation for everything later, where initial decisions, though well-intentioned, were limited by incomplete data and pressure to act fast without fully understanding how Emily Adams had vanished. Right after initial approaches were complete and preliminary statements recorded amid ongoing disruption, investigation focus shifted fully to scene assessment, under 1971 professional standards, a time when scene preservation, evidence collection, and trace analysis were manual, relying heavily on investigators' personal experience over rigorous scientific protocols as later. The area around the Adams home was searched, section by section, starting with spaces most directly tied to Emily's daily activities, including front yard, backyard, side paths, and spots a 4-year-old frequented, aiming to pinpoint the last reliable sighting before disappearance. Checking this area showed no clear disturbance, ground without struggle or drag marks, fences and entrances without break-in signs, details typically expected in violent abductions completely absent, complicating case nature determination from the start, alongside physical space checks, investigators noted items directly linked to Emily. Objects tied to her habits found in positions inconsistent with prolonged voluntary departure. These examined not just as personal belongings, but potential indicators of event sequence, though their evidentiary value unclear at the time. Item conditions showed no preparation or packing signs, not reflecting intentional leaving, even less like Emily, wandering off to play far, making a sudden event in short time more noteworthy. Overall scene analysis revealed absence of signs, usually concluding quick accident or overt violence. Instead, a suspicious normality, where everything seemed in place, except Emily missing. A paradox forcing inference on assumptions over visual evidence. Checking the last sighting area was done with maximum detail allowed, including possible movement directions, access to nearby roads, ease for an outsider to approach unnoticed, and here investigators realized the supposedly safe environment had certain blind spots where something could happen quickly, leaving few traces. Scene status analysis raised time factor questions, as gap between last sighting and family discovery was short enough to rule out complex scenarios, but long enough for external intervention undetected immediately, especially in a community used to children freely in open spaces. Investigators noted no evidence Emily took many personal items, weakening runaway theory, and directing attention to quick removal against her will. However, in 1971 context, establishing stranger abduction wasn't obvious conclusion. Preliminary findings balanced with alternatives, like known person involvement, or unintended situation, leading Emily away from safety. This ambiguity made initial evidence, though scarce, especially critical as sole basis for next investigation directions. Any interpretation error here potentially misdirecting resources. Synthesizing all scene provided, investigators reached cautious preliminary finding that abduction couldn't be ruled out, even many factors supporting it over others, but lacking direct proof and errors trace collection limits. This noted as inference, direction not official lead. The scene with all it didn't reveal, became a space of unanswered questions, where each small detail could mean much if contextualized right. And from here, investigation moved to event reconstruction and human evaluation, over relying on clear physical traces, a reality continuing to shape the entire process of clarifying how Emily Adams vanished on what seemed a completely normal morning. With the crime scene providing no clear resolution and physical evidence, limited to indirect indicators, the investigation was forced to shift its focus to synthesizing all the data collected in the initial hours, including the location where Emily was last seen, the condition of her personal belongings, the spatial layout around the house, along with statements from family members and nearby witnesses, in order to construct a picture of events that relied more on inference than confirmation. This synthesis process clearly revealed inconsistencies across the sources of information, as each statement reflected a different perspective on the same brief period of time, with overlapping timelines, unconscious adjustments, influenced by others' accounts, and no witness able to definitively confirm having seen the moment Emily left the safe area, compelling investigators to accept that the initial data foundation was incomplete from the moment it was formed. On that basis, the main hypotheses began to be developed to guide the next steps, including the possibility that Emily voluntarily left the familiar area and met with an accident, the possibility that she was taken by someone known to her for some reason, and the possibility that she was approached and taken by a stranger in a short window without leaving clear traces, with each hypothesis weighed against varying degrees of plausibility, based on what the scene and statements allowed to be inferred. The accident hypothesis quickly encountered difficulties when compared to practical factors, as there were no signs that Emily had taken essential items for leaving home for an extended period, nor evidence that she had accessed dangerous areas close to the house in such a short time frame, causing this scenario to gradually be seen as less fitting, though it could not be entirely ruled out. The hypothesis involving intervention by someone known was examined more thoroughly, as it aligned with the social context of that era, where most missing child cases were often attributed to family disputes or personal relationships, and from this point, the investigation's attention began to strongly focus on those with direct connections to Emily, particularly family members and individuals who regularly appeared in her daily life. The assessment of potential involvement by relatives was conducted alongside re-examining collected statements, searching for minor contradictions, inconsistencies, or gaps that, according to the investigative logic of the time, could be interpreted as signs of concealment, even though many of these actually stemmed from panic and psychological stress. The investigators, heavily influenced by 1970s investigative thinking, which emphasized the assumption that the greatest risk to children came from those closest to them, began prioritizing analysis of relationships within the Addams family, from daily routines and potential underlying conflicts to minor details in how questions were answered, and this focus gradually formed a directed framework of thinking, where information fitting the family involvement hypothesis was noted more carefully, while details that did not fit tended to be downplayed. Concurrently, the hypothesis of Emily being abducted by a stranger was retained as a possibility, but not prioritized due to the lack of direct evidence and the prevailing belief of that era that random abductions were rare, especially in small, safe communities like the one where the Addams family lived. The influence of this era's investigative mindset was evident in how risks were assessed and resources allocated, with a preference for delving deeply into known relationships, rather than expanding searches for external factors beyond the familiar area, an approach considered reasonable and effective in many cases, but carrying the risk of overlooking less common scenarios. The process of forming hypotheses did not occur in a vacuum, but was impacted by pressure to quickly establish a clear investigative direction to reassure the community, and create the sense that the case was under control, making the selection of a priority hypothesis a practical necessity, rather than a conclusion based solely on evidence. After weighing the scene factors, statements, and social context, the decision on the priority investigative direction was made, focusing on clarifying the role of those closest to Emily, viewing this as the path most likely to yield answers quickly, given the limited information, while other hypotheses remained on paper but did not receive the same level of attention and resources. This decision at the time was not seen as a mistake, but as the result of a reasoning process aligned with contemporary investigative standards, where narrowing the scope was considered necessary to avoid dispersion, but it also laid the groundwork for an investigative trajectory that would later reveal clear limitations when faced with a case that did not follow familiar patterns. And from here, the official investigation entered a phase where hypotheses were no longer considered equally, but were ranked in a priority order shaped in the very first days after Emily Addams disappeared, after the priority investigative direction had been established in a context lacking direct evidence, and clearly influenced by the professional mindset of the era. Interrogations became the primary tool for reinforcing or eliminating the hypotheses being pursued, starting with Emily Addams's family members, those closest to the victim, and thus the first subjects placed under the pressure of repeated questions across multiple time frames. Family interrogations were conducted in the common manner of the time, focusing on reconstructing daily routines, internal relationships, potential conflicts, and any details that could be interpreted as motive or opportunity, while the family was still in a state of emotional collapse, trying to cooperate, while facing the feeling of implicit suspicion, causing their statements to be affected not only by fragmented memories, but also by prolonged stress. Repeated interrogations over time, with the same questions asked at different points, led to the emergence of minor differences in accounts, not due to intentional deceit, but because human memory tends to restructure under pressure, especially when repeatedly recalling a traumatic event, and these differences began to be noted as noteworthy signs in the records. Concurrently with the family, the key witness, who had direct contact with Emily in the period immediately before she disappeared, was also interrogated multiple times. with emphasis on this person's reaction to the unusual factor that had appeared, the exact timing, and the reasons for not acting more decisively, with answers that were initially estimative, gradually scrutinized through a lens of suspicion, as prior hesitation was interpreted as a sign of concealment or lack of honesty. Even without specific evidence to prove it, in comparing statements across interrogation sessions, investigators discovered minor contradictions, sometimes just differences in event sequence or description of the same detail, but in the context of an investigation seeking anchors, these contradictions quickly gained elevated significance, becoming the basis for deeper assumptions about each individual's degree of involvement. Investigative attention gradually focused on specific subjects, not necessarily due to new evidence, but because their statements contained elements that did not fully align with the priority hypothesis, and in an investigative environment, under pressure to narrow the scope, these mismatches were seen as sufficient to justify increased suspicion. The investigators, in their effort to find consistency, began categorizing information in a way that supported the chosen hypothesis, unconsciously emphasizing details that reinforced suspicion, while downplaying or setting aside elements that could open other directions, a common phenomenon in criminal investigations, but hard to recognize as it was occurring. The prolonged interrogation process not only pressured the family and witnesses, but also impacted the investigation in reverse, as those questioned, after multiple contacts with police, began adjusting their responses to avoid misunderstanding, causing statements to become more defensive and less natural, further heightening the sense that something was being withheld. Meanwhile, the absence of physical evidence caused investigators to rely increasingly on interpreting behavior and speech, a method easily influenced by biases and pre-existing assumptions, especially in the social context of that era, where the belief that most child-related incidents stemmed from family relationships was deeply embedded in professional thinking. Interrogations of other area witnesses, though conducted, did not yield information strong enough to shake the main investigative direction, as their statements were either too vague or did not fit the prioritized scenario, and were thus categorized as low value, causing the range of considered information to narrow further. As suspicion concentrated on certain subjects, investigative resources were gradually adjusted accordingly, with more time and effort devoted to checking, cross-referencing, and seeking errors in their statements, while other directions, including the possibility of intervention from outside the familiar community, did not receive comparable attention. The formation of a misdirected investigation did not happen abruptly, but was the result of a series of small decisions, each appearing reasonable in its context, from focusing interrogations on the family, emphasizing minor contradictions, to increasing suspicion toward certain individuals without direct evidence, all combining to create an investigative trajectory, increasingly distant from comprehensively considering other scenarios. By the end of this phase, although no official conclusion had been reached, the structure of the investigation had gradually been shaped toward fixing suspicion, where certain subjects were placed under the microscope, while other possibilities were pushed to the margins, and this structure would continue to dominate how any new clues, if they emerged, were received and interpreted in the subsequent steps of the Emily Adams disappearance case. The increasingly intense focus on interrogations and fixing suspicion on certain familiar individuals could not replace the obvious reality that Emily Adams had still not been found, and this very gap forced the investigation to expand into a parallel direction that was more physical in nature, aiming to scan spaces rather than people, in the hope that traces of the girl or the incident that occurred still existed somewhere beyond the house. And the vague statements, community search forces were mobilized on a large scale, not only from those close to the Adams family, but also from residents in the surrounding area, volunteer groups, local organizations, and individuals who joined voluntarily, due to the shared sense of unease when a child disappeared in a neighborhood long considered safe. creating a vast but hard-to-coordinate search network in terms of methods and scene discipline. The search area quickly extended beyond the familiar routes around the house, spreading in directions accessible by vehicle or on foot in a short time, based on varying assumptions about whether Emily might have moved on her own or been taken by someone else, with each assumption leading to a separate search approach, from scanning quiet back roads to checking larger traffic points where a child could be removed from the area. Natural areas became focal points in many search waves, including dense forests, riverbanks, vacant lots, and overlooked spaces where the likelihood of an accident or concealment of traces was considered high, while man-made areas such as warehouses, abandoned constructions, drainage paths, bridges, culverts, and other auxiliary structures were also thoroughly checked with the same priority, reflecting efforts to cover all possibilities given the limited initial information. This search process occurred with high intensity and duration, but was markedly affected by the lack of specialized equipment and standardized procedures, causing many activities to rely on personal experience and terrain familiarity, rather than scientific methods, while increasing the risk of missing or disturbing any fragile remaining traces. Concurrently with fieldwork searches, local media began playing an increasingly prominent role in disseminating information about Emily Adams's disappearance, bringing her image and basic description to a wider audience in the hope that someone outside the familiar area might provide new information, with this involvement both expanding access to leads and creating public pressure on the investigative force. As each broadcast implicitly questioned the case's progress, media attention triggered a wave of public feedback, including calls, letters, and tips from people who believed they had seen a child resembling Emily in various locations, from nearby towns to farther areas, forcing police to allocate resources to verify each lead, even though most yielded no concrete results, creating a time-consuming loop with disproportionate investigative value. Within the search forces, fatigue began to emerge as days passed without significant discoveries, with the community's initial spirit gradually giving way to anxiety and helplessness, especially as high-probability areas had been thoroughly checked without any sign of Emily, causing hope of finding her through direct searches to become increasingly tenuous. The lack of concrete results from search activities also affected how the investigation was perceived, as each scanned and excluded area further narrowed the space for hypotheses based on accident or Emily leaving on her own, while simultaneously reinforcing the possibility that she had been removed from the area very early, a scenario difficult to verify through fieldwork searches alone. Limitations in controlling community search activities, including many untrained participants entering the same spaces, raised concerns that if important traces had existed, they might have been trampled, moved, or inadvertently erased, further diminishing evidentiary value over time. By the stage when the search area had expanded to the maximum feasible extent, results remained only a long list of checked locations without verified discoveries, forcing the investigative force to confront the reality that expanded searches, though necessary and demonstrating maximum effort, had not provided answers to the core question of where Emily Adams was. This impasse not only reflected the limits of search activities given the initial lack of data, but also contributed to shifting the case's strategic focus, as hope of finding Emily through spatial scanning was gradually replaced by greater reliance on inference, behavioral analysis, and the previously formed hypotheses, laying the groundwork for the next phase where leads were eliminated, and the investigative direction continued to narrow along the trajectory already shaped from the beginning. The prolonged deadlock stemming from the expanded search efforts, where the area had been scoured to the maximum extent yet no authentic signs of Emily Adams's location emerged, created an invisible force that pushed the investigation back toward the hypotheses previously formed. And in this process, information that did not align with the prioritized line of reasoning began to be viewed through the lens of exclusion rather than exploitation. The initial statements, which were already vague, when cross-checked against the dominant hypothesis guiding the investigation, gradually revealed their incompatibility, not because they were entirely wrong, but because they did not help reinforce the scenario being pursued, leading to these details being assessed as low value or unreliable. Some witnesses who had provided information about elements outside the familiar area or about phenomena not directly related to Emily's family were gradually sidelined from the investigation's focus, their statements retained in the files, but not considered as a basis for developing new directions, because they did not fit the logic of reasoning that had been shaped early on. This filtering process, though carried out with the aim of clarifying the truth, inadvertently created a closed loop, where only information reinforcing the main hypothesis was retained and analyzed in depth, while other leads, even those with potential to open alternative scenarios, were seen as noise and gradually pushed to the margins. Witnesses who could not provide precise timelines or could not repeat their statements consistently across multiple sessions began to be evaluated as unreliable, and once their credibility was questioned, all related information lost weight in the eyes of the investigators, making the likelihood of re-engaging these leads increasingly low. In that context, indirect leads, or those that could not be immediately verified, instead of being preserved as open possibilities, were discarded for not yielding immediate results, reflecting the pressure to concentrate resources on directions that appeared most feasible under constraints of time and manpower. The narrowing of the investigation's scope did not occur through a single decision, but through a series of small choices, each aimed at increasing efficiency, but collectively they significantly reduced the breadth of the overall picture, causing the investigation to focus increasingly on specific scenarios and overlook less common possibilities. As offbeat hypotheses were gradually eliminated from active consideration, the investigation's structure became more rigid. Meetings and internal reports repeated familiar conclusions without new data to challenge them, creating a sense of progress on paper, but in reality, a stagnation in approaching the truth. The growing dependence on initial assumptions meant that any new information emerging was interpreted in a way that fit the existing framework, rather than being evaluated independently, reducing the ability to detect details that could break the current investigative trajectory. Meanwhile, time continued to pass, witnesses' memories faded, community and media attention waned, and resources allocated to the case began to be redirected to other priorities, causing the investigation to lose the initial momentum driven by the urgency of a missing child case. The lack of specific progress from the remaining leads reinforced the feeling that all viable paths had been tried, even though in reality, many possibilities had never been fully explored, and this very feeling contributed to an acceptance of stagnation as an inevitable state. Within the investigative team, accumulated fatigue from weeks of fruitless work began to affect how information was evaluated, making decisions more cautious, biased toward maintaining existing conclusions, rather than risking new directions that could consume additional resources without guaranteed success. As a result, the scope of the investigation narrowed further, the number of leads actively considered decreased, and the ability to uncover the truth was limited by the very reasoning structure that had been built, where anything not fitting the main hypothesis was eliminated before having a chance to be fully verified. This phase marked a quiet but decisive turning point, when the investigation, though still ongoing in name, had lost the necessary flexibility to adapt to a case that did not follow familiar patterns, and each lead discarded, each witness removed from consideration, contributed to widening the gap between what had been investigated and what actually happened to Emily Adams on the day she disappeared. The gradual narrowing of the investigation's scope along with the successive elimination of potential leads pushed Emily Adams's case into a suspended state, where operational activities continued in name but no longer produced any substantial changes, because all familiar directions had been repeated multiple times without yielding new results, and each update report merely reflected what was already known, rather than opening up alternative approaches. In that context, the investigation no longer progressed in an active sense, but shifted to a maintenance state, where files were periodically reviewed, old hypotheses were reiterated in internal meetings, but no new data strong enough to alter the trajectory formed in the first weeks after Emily's disappearance. The absence of new evidence became the deciding factor. As everything the scene could provide had been exploited to its limit, related items had been documented early on, and there were no additional discoveries of physical traces, direct witnesses, or verified information from outside the community, causing the investigation to fall into complete dependence on reasoning based on old data. Concurrently, witnesses and related leads also began to decline in both quantity and quality. As memories faded over time, those who had provided information could no longer add new details, and some individuals were no longer willing, or no longer required to participate further in the process, leading to the input sources of information becoming increasingly depleted. This decline did not happen abruptly, but manifested through small signs, such as public tip calls becoming rarer, local media reducing coverage frequency, and the investigative team having to shift priorities to newer cases with higher urgency, reflecting the reality that resources could not be maintained indefinitely for a case without progress. In that environment, the decision to close active operations gradually came to be seen as a practical step rather than an admission of failure, because continuing to allocate manpower to an investigation not producing new leads was deemed inefficient in the broader context, where many other cases demanded immediate attention. The process of making this decision was carried out through internal evaluations, reviewing the entire file, determining that all feasible investigative directions had been pursued within the capabilities of the time, and concluding that there was no basis for continuing active investigation without new information or evidence emerging. Closing active operations did not mean the case was completely abandoned, but rather a shift in status from an ongoing investigation to an archived file, where information was preserved for potential reopening in the future, if conditions allowed. But in practice, this shift marked the end of the phase of highest effort to find Emily through traditional methods. In the process of reclassifying the case, Emily Adams was placed in the group of cases presumed to involve death, not based on evidence confirming death, but based on the combination of time elapsed, no signs of survival, and statistical experience of that era regarding survival chances of children in prolonged missing cases, an approach reflecting the limitations of knowledge and technology at the time. This classification carried significant administrative importance, as it shaped how the case was recorded in the system, how resources were allocated, and how community expectations were adjusted, while creating a clear boundary between the active investigation phase and the passive waiting phase. For the investigative team, this was a closing step, where the file was finalized with final notes, main hypotheses summarized, and unanswered questions retained as an inevitable part of an unsolved case. While for the Adams family, though not fully reflected in operational documents, this decision meant that hope of finding Emily through direct action by authorities became increasingly fragile. From a systemic perspective, Emily Adams' case officially entered cold case status, a term reflecting not only the temperature of the file, but also the freezing of investigative possibilities under current conditions, where any further efforts depended entirely on the emergence of a new external factor, whether a late confession, accidental discovery, or technological advance not existing at that time. This transition closed the initial phase of the case, where decisions made under conditions of incomplete information and influenced by the era's thinking shaped the file's fate for decades to come. And from here, Emily Adams' story was no longer continued through daily investigative reports, but preserved in silent file folders, awaiting a much more distant moment than anyone involved in the initial investigation could have imagined. The transfer of Emily Adams' case to cold case status, and its archiving as an inactive file, created a prolonged silence in the investigative system, but on the other side of that silence, Emily's life did not stop, was not frozen according to the reports, but continued to unfold in a reality completely separate, where she was no longer called by the name Emily Adams, and did not exist as a missing child, but grew up under a different identity established to replace the severed past. This new identity was not just a different name on paper, but came with a backstory simple enough to avoid suspicion, consistent enough to endure over time, and flexible enough to adapt to natural questions that might arise during growth, creating a new foundation for Emily's entire personality formation and perception. The new living environment she was brought to was not extreme or isolated, not a space completely cut off from society, but a community normal enough for everything to proceed smoothly, where children went to school, adults went to work, social relationships formed according to familiar patterns, and that very normality became the most important factor in maintaining the concealment, because nothing was different enough to attract attention or raise serious questions from outside. In that environment, Emily was raised according to ordinary standards, taken to school, received medical care, participated in age-appropriate social activities, and all administrative traces related to her were tied to the new identity, creating a continuous chain of verification that made the existence of a different past identity unnecessary to explain any aspect of her current life. The key factor enabling this process to be sustainable lay in the absence of clear memories from early life, as Emily's first 4 years, disrupted by shock and sudden change, did not leave structured memories strong enough to resist the new imposed story, but only existed as fragmented sensations, vague images, or impressions that could not be tied to a specific place or person. Those faint memory fragments, if they appeared, were easily dissolved into a child's imagination or explained as dreams, random thoughts, not enough to form systematic doubts about her true origins. The process of growing up under the new identity did not occur with awareness that something was being hidden, but as a natural acceptance of what the surrounding environment provided, because children tend to trust absolutely the story adults tell them, especially when that story is continuously reinforced through behavior, words, and official documents. Emily learned to understand herself through the role assigned in the new family and society, from her position in the family, relationships with those around her, to how she was named and recorded in various contexts, all consistent to the point of creating no clear discrepancy between inner perception and external reality. This adaptation process was not a series of dramatic events, but a slow accumulation of everyday experiences, where each passing day further reinforced the sense that the current life was obvious, and the past, if it existed, had no clear role in explaining the present self. In that environment, Emily was not placed in situations requiring her to cross-check her story against independent sources, because the administrative and social systems of that era were not connected in a way that allowed easy cross-verification, especially for children, enabling the new identity to exist without facing rigorous scrutiny. Small differences, if any, between Emily and those around her, were seen as personal characteristics, not enough to be interpreted as signs of a hidden history, and the very absence of clear conflicting elements reduced the likelihood of doubts arising from both inside and outside. Over time, the new identity was no longer a temporary overlay, but became the foundation for all relationships and decisions in Emily's life, from education, work, to how she viewed herself and her place in the world, creating a self-reinforcing loop. where each new experience further confirmed that the current story was real. The absence of memories of her biological family did not create a specific sense of loss, because Emily had no clear image to remember or mourn, and thus her life was not dominated by the sadness or doubt often seen in cases of conscious family separation. Instead, vague sensations, if they appeared, existed as nameless unease, not strong enough to drive searching or verification actions, and easily overwhelmed by the practical demands of daily life. Emily's adaptation to the new life was so complete that, even when viewed from outside, it was difficult to pinpoint a specific moment when she shifted from being taken away to belonging, because that process had no clear boundary, but was a continuous transition between learned and accepted roles. The very smoothness of this process created the central paradox of the case: when a child presumed dead in investigative files could grow up, study, work, and build relationships in a different life, without leaving clear traces for those who once searched for her. By the time Emily reached adulthood, the new identity had been deeply ingrained, not only in documents but also in her own perception, making the distance between who she was now and the 4-year-old child who disappeared in 1971 almost impossible to bridge through memory. And the parallel existence of these two realities, one a frozen cold case, the other an ongoing life, reflected the limits of traditional investigative methods when facing disappearances that left no clear traces and were concealed by the very normality of everyday life. Life established stably under the new identity did not stop at the initial adaptation phase, but continued to expand with each developmental milestone of Emily as she entered school age, where the education system became one of the first structures to officially record and sustainably reinforce that false identity. Because from the moment of enrollment, her new name was entered into records, report cards, and all related files, creating a continuous chain of data over the years with no connection whatsoever to the name Emily Adams that had been frozen in the cold case file. Emily's learning process proceeded relatively normally, without serious signs of behavioral instability or integration difficulties. She attended classes, made friends, completed the curriculum on schedule, and teacher evaluations reflected a child who was not notable in a negative way, further reducing the likelihood of drawing attention or raising questions about her origins. In the school environment, where students' personal information is typically accepted as given facts, rather than subjects requiring verification, Emily's identity was fully accepted based on the provided documents, and once entered into the system, it continued to self-affirm through each school year, each class transition, each academic report, creating a seamless school history with no obvious gaps. Parallel to the educational records, medical and administrative records also played an important role in reinforcing this false identity, because each interaction with the healthcare system, from routine checkups to other necessary procedures, Emily's personal information was recorded, based on existing documents, creating a consistent chain of medical records, in which medical history, vaccinations, and basic data were built from a new starting point, unrelated to the lost first 4 years of life. It was precisely the lack of connectivity between data systems at that time, especially across states or different agencies, that made cross-verification rare, and thus Emily's medical and administrative records, though built on a false foundation, still existed legally in the eyes of the system. During the maturation process, some minor irregularities in paperwork might appear, such as incomplete information about the newborn period, or details filled in later than usual, but these irregularities were not serious enough to trigger deeper scrutiny, because in the social and administrative context of decades earlier, incomplete personal records were not uncommon, especially for families with relocation circumstances or inadequate document storage. Those irregularities, if reviewed later, could be seen as early warning signs, but at the time they appeared, they were merely minor technical details, easily explained by common administrative reasons, and thus not strong enough to shake the story of Emily's identity. The important thing is that throughout this process, Emily had no internal reason to doubt her identity, because every surrounding factor confirmed the current story, from how she was called by name in class, how teachers and friends recognized her, to the official documents she encountered as she grew older, all consistent and without contradiction to her personal experiences. The absence of clear suspicion about her identity also stemmed from the fact that Emily did not possess specific enough memories to compare, no clear images of her birth family, no strong emotional markers to question differences, and thus, any vague feelings, if present, existed at a level difficult to name. Easily set aside in the rhythm of daily life, as Emily grew up and engaged with more complex administrative procedures, such as registering for extracurricular activities, applying for part-time job-related documents or other personal needs, her identity continued to be confirmed by the system, without major obstacles, because each new procedure relied on previously existing records, creating a closed loop of validation. In that context, even individuals who interacted directly with Emily in professional roles, such as administrative staff or medical personnel, had no motive or basis to raise doubts, because there were no surface signs indicating discrepancy, and deeper checks into personal origins were not within their routine responsibilities. Over time, the false identity not only existed as an administrative reality, but also became internalized, becoming the way Emily understood herself, her past, and her place in society, further reducing the possibility of internal suspicion emerging. The seamlessness of the educational process and administrative records created a sense that Emily's life had been fully documented from beginning to end, even though in reality, a significant part had been replaced, and it was this very seamlessness that weakened the ability to recognize the absence of the early years. In the eyes of outsiders, Emily was an individual with a clear history, consistent educational and medical records, stable social relationships, and no manifestations suggesting she was living under an identity not her own, further reducing the likelihood of anyone proactively questioning her true identity. Even when facing procedures requiring higher levels of verification upon entering adulthood, the relevant systems still relied on available data without tracing back to the newborn period, because the technological and procedural limits of that era did not encourage or allow widespread deep checks as later on. As a result, Emily grew up in a world where everything reinforced the current story, from school, hospital, administrative agencies, to personal relationships, creating a continuous wall of confirmation surrounding the false identity, making the truth about her original identity not only hidden from the investigation system, but also hidden from the consciousness of the person living under that identity. It was precisely the absence of clear suspicion during this phase that allowed the false identity to persist for many years without challenge, prolonging the distance between the 4-year-old child, who disappeared in 1971, and the adult living a normal life, and that distance, created not by a single action, but by hundreds of small repeated administrative decisions, made connecting the two realities increasingly difficult as time continued to pass. The seamless existence of Emily's false identity over many years of education and administration was not only due to system loopholes, but was also tightly linked to the central role of the guardian, the figure holding the key position in shaping, maintaining, and controlling the entire story of her origins. Because throughout her maturation, all information Emily accessed about herself was mediated through this person, from simple family stories to decisions related to paperwork, residence, and social relationships. The guardian's role cannot be understood simply as an active concealer using violence or threats, but more like a story manager, the one holding the authority to decide which information was revealed, which was omitted, and how gaps were filled with explanations reasonable enough to avoid suspicion. Control over Emily's personal information was carried out consistently and long-term through limiting questions about the past, directing responses when necessary, and proactively handling situations that could lead to external curiosity, especially during phases when Emily was too young to self-recognize or challenge what was told. Stories about her background were constructed in a simplified way, avoiding specific details that could be cross-checked or verified, while being emotional enough to be accepted as a natural part of family life, making Emily not feel deprived of information, but simply living in a normal reality, with limits similar to many other families. Maintaining the false identity did not require extreme daily actions, but relied on consistency in small decisions, from choosing schools, living environments, to interactions with administrative agencies, where the guardian always acted as representative, minimizing Emily's direct contact with sources that could contradict the established story. In situations requiring documents or personal information, the guardian handled preparation and presentation, creating a buffer between Emily and the system, thereby controlling the flow of information in and out, while limiting unexpected questions. Notably, this concealment process was not accompanied by clear signs of physical or emotional abuse, no mistreatment making Emily feel threatened or forced to stay silent. On the contrary, her daily life had the appearance of stability, even care enough to create a sense of security and attachment, making suspicion of the guardian unlikely from a child's perspective. It was precisely the absence of abuse that kept this relationship from close scrutiny by authorities or the surrounding community. Because there were no surface signs indicating Emily was in a situation needing intervention, and thus, the guardian could continue maintaining information control without challenge. In outsiders' eyes, the relationship between Emily and the guardian was not significantly different from other families, with no manifestations of tension or conflict typically associated with coercive concealment cases, and this very normalcy served as an effective camouflage, making the concealing behavior invisible in community life. Over time, the guardian not only controlled past information, but also indirectly shaped how Emily viewed identity-related questions, by responding consistently to any signs of curiosity, or redirecting conversations to other topics, creating a communication pattern where digging deep into personal origins was neither encouraged nor overtly forbidden. This control, because it was not coercive, was easily accepted by Emily as part of the family relationship, and gradually became taken for granted, where unasked questions were not due to fear, but lack of strong reason to ask. Maintaining the false identity over years also required caution in avoiding comparison situations, such as limiting contact with people or environments likely to evoke past questions, a strategy implemented, not through complete isolation, but through deliberate selection of relationships and social spaces. During phases when Emily began accessing the outside world more, the guardian's role remained decisive in guiding, advising, and sometimes indirectly intervening in important decisions, ensuring the false identity was preserved without creating a feeling of excessive control. This created a clear paradox, where prolonged concealment was not based on cruelty or violence, but on consistency, stability, and the guardian's ability to read social situations, blurring the boundary between care and control. In that context, Emily grew up feeling the guardian was the most reliable source of information about herself, and thus, even when vague past questions arose, they were easily resolved with familiar explanations without seeking external confirmation. Maintaining the false identity over decades was not the result of a detailed plan from the start, but the accumulation of consistent choices, where each small decision aimed to avoid disrupting the current story. And over time, this accumulation created a concealment structure strong enough to last long-term. The absence of abuse signs meant this relationship was not labeled dangerous in society's eyes, while weakening the possibility of early intervention by child protection agencies, because all surface evaluation criteria showed Emily was cared for and developing in an acceptable environment. As a result, the guardian's role became inseparable from the existence of the false identity, both protector of Emily's current life and keeper of the door to the past, and this duality, made discovering the truth particularly difficult, because it did not involve breaking a clear violent structure, but required piercing through the shell of normalcy, stability, and outward care, where concealment was disguised as a natural part of family life over many years. The persistent existence of the false identity that Emily carried for many decades was not only the result of the guardian's information control role, but also based on a broader systemic foundation, where the method of establishing the false identity occurred in an administrative context, allowing gaps to exist without being seen as abnormal, especially in the period before regulations on Social Security numbers and interconnected databases became strict. Emily's false identity was formed not necessarily through sophisticated document forgery in the modern sense, but by exploiting the loose registration mechanisms of that era, when recording children's personal information depended more on adult declarations than independent verification systems, allowing a new name, an adjusted birth date, and a simple origin story to be entered into records without deep cross-referencing with central data. In many cases, registering basic information for a child could occur at the local level, through small administrative agencies, where records were stored on paper and rarely shared or compared with other areas, facilitating a new identity to exist parallel to the old one, without direct collision. This administrative vulnerability was even more pronounced in the context before Social Security numbers were widely and strictly used as a unique identifier for each individual, because during that period, many important procedures did not require an SSN, or only needed minimal information, making cross-verification almost non-existent for children. The lack of a centralized and interconnected database across states, educational, medical, and administrative agencies created an environment where records existed as fragmented pieces, each self-affirming its validity, without needing to reference an overall picture, and it was in that environment that Emily's false identity could be gradually reinforced through each system interaction. The reason this identity went undetected for decades lay not only in technological shortages, but also in the foundational assumptions of the system at that time, when information provided by guardians or parents was assumed truthful, and deep suspicion or checks were only triggered by clear signs of fraud or serious contradiction, which Emily's case did not display on the surface. Each time an administrative agency accepted Emily's information and recorded it as valid, the false identity gained another layer of reinforcement, creating a cumulative effect, where the more records existed, the less likely suspicion arose, because the outward consistency among documents made them validate each other. Even when minor deficiencies appeared, such as lacking full newborn records or unclear early years, these details were often overlooked or explained by common administrative reasons of that era, such as lost records, home birth, or relocation between areas, making them not viewed as signs of a serious issue. The long-term existence of the false identity was also supported by the fact that there was no proactive mechanism to review old records for duplicates or contradictions, especially in cases unrelated to social welfare or programs requiring high verification, and thus, without a specific triggering event, the system had no reason to go back and check an individual's origins long recorded. When compared to modern standards, the difference becomes clear, because today, establishing and maintaining a false identity long-term faces many more barriers, from requiring SSN early on to the existence of interconnected electronic databases across agencies, allowing quick cross-referencing and detection of contradictions in short time. Modern systems also rely more on multi-layer identity authentication, including birth records, medical, educational, and financial data, making the absence of part of personal history more noticeable, especially when individuals enter phases needing deeper verification. In that context, Emily's case reflects a transitional phase of the administrative system, where vulnerabilities existed not due to individual negligence, but because the operational structure was not designed to detect rare scenarios like a child being taken and raised under a different identity. The difference between the two eras also shows that Emily's false identity going undetected for decades was not unusual in the historical context, but a predictable consequence of a system not equipped to handle exceptions, especially when surface signs all indicated a normal and stable life. It was that very normalcy that obscured the ability to question, because the system was designed to react to clear abnormalities, rather than proactively seek well-camouflaged subtle discrepancies. Comparing to modern standards also highlights another paradox, where today's technological and administrative advances not only help prevent similar cases, but also open possibilities to trace back old records, to uncover hidden truths, a capability that did not exist when Emily's false identity was established and reinforced. From a systemic perspective, Emily's story shows that false identities do not exist in a vacuum, but are nurtured by a network of processes, assumptions, and technological limits, where each small vulnerability alone was not enough to cause major consequences, but combined, they created a gap wide enough for a person to live a full different life undetected. That gap, when viewed from the present, is not only a failure of the old system, but also a reminder of the importance of continuously updating and connecting identity verification mechanisms, because what was once seen as rare and unprepared for can become reality with consequences lasting decades, as in the case of Emily Adams, where a false identity was maintained not by a single action, but by the prolonged silence of an entire system not yet tight enough to ask the right questions at the right time. The loose administrative foundation and the consistently maintained story of origin created conditions for the false identity to exist, stably, but in Emily's daily life, that stability was not completely sealed. Instead, small deviations gradually appeared, not clear enough to shatter the current reality, but persistent enough to exist, like faint cracks in perception, starting with very minor contradictions in the family story she absorbed over the years. When the same detail was recounted with different nuances depending on the moment, or when a brief answer was used to close a topic that could have been explained in greater depth. These contradictions were not dramatic or direct, not appearing as completely opposing statements, but existing as a lack of synchronization in the telling, making certain details become more ambiguous each time they were mentioned, and it was precisely this ambiguity that caused Emily, even without clear awareness, to gradually form the feeling that some parts of the family story were not fully revealed. The sense of not belonging emerged in a similar way, not as a complete estrangement from her living environment, since Emily still integrated, still had clear relationships and social roles, but as a subtle distance between herself and the stories that connected others. When shared memories about relatives, family origins, or multi-generational ties did not create the same level of emotional resonance for her. In social contexts where others easily connected through shared past stories, Emily noticed she lacked a similar layer of memory, not because she had no stories to tell, but because her stories were always brief, closed, and lacking in detail. Enough to exist, but not enough to expand. This feeling did not lead to obvious isolation, as Emily still found her place in the present, but it created a psychological foundation where not fully belonging became a familiar state, not causing acute pain, but also not disappearing over time. From these small contradictions and the sense of being out of phase, vague doubts about her identity began to form, not in the form of direct questions about who she was or where she came from, but as fleeting thoughts, moments of self-questioning that did not last long enough to become purposeful actions. These doubts often appeared, and then vanished in the rhythm of daily life, easily overwhelmed by immediate concerns, like studies, work, personal relationships, and thus did not accumulate into a strong enough motivation to seek answers. The lack of verification actions stemmed from many intertwined factors, among which the superficial consistency of her personal records played an important role, as every document, every administrative confirmation Emily encountered reinforced the same story, making internal doubts, if they arose, seem to contradict the reality validated by the system. Additionally, the guardian's role in controlling information continued to create a soft barrier, not through prohibition, but through guidance, making deeper questioning seem unnecessary or inappropriate in the context of the established family relationship. The small contradictions in the family story, since they did not lead to immediate negative consequences, were gradually explained by Emily as natural memory lapses or differences in storytelling style, a common and reasonable explanation in everyday life, sufficient to soothe the need to dig deeper. The sense of not belonging, when not named or publicly shared, became part of her inner identity, rather than a problem to solve, causing Emily to learn to live with it instead of seeing it as a signal requiring action. Vague doubts about identity, lacking specific data to latch onto, could not transform into a clear verifiable question and thus did not trigger the verification process, especially in a context where searching for past personal information was neither easy nor common. Each time a fleeting question appeared, it was quickly soothed by ready explanations or the busyness of the present, creating a repeating cycle where doubts were not large enough to disrupt the formed balance. In the eyes of outsiders, there were no signs that Emily was carrying an identity crisis, as all surface expressions aligned with a normal maturation process, and precisely this lack of clear manifestations reduced the likelihood of anyone proactively opening or encouraging verification of her origins. Even in moments when Emily encountered broader social stories about lost children or adoption cases, those stories were still viewed as external events, not close enough to create a direct personal connection, as the distance between an abstract case and personal experience was too great to bridge with only vague feelings. The lack of verification actions also reflected a common psychological factor, where people tend to avoid questions that could shake the foundation of their current life, especially when that foundation, though imperfect, still provided stability and security. In Emily's case, digging into identity doubts promised no clear short-term benefits, while potentially risking disruption of familiar relationships and structures, making the choice not to act a natural reflex. Over time, these prolonged signs of deviation did not disappear, but blended into her inner life, existing as small echoes without clear beginnings or ends, not strong enough to shape behavior, but durable enough to maintain the feeling that something did not quite fit. It was precisely the silent prolongation of these signs that contributed to maintaining the fragile balance, where the false identity continued to exist without challenge, as there was no explosive moment forcing Emily to confront doubts head-on, and no external agent strong enough to break the normal facade built over many years. As a result, over a long period of her life, the small contradictions, sense of not belonging, and vague identity doubts coexisted without leading to verification actions, creating a prolonged silence between truth and perception, where signs were present but not connected, and that silence became the decisive factor in the false identity, continuing to be maintained for many more years before any turning point had a chance to appear. The prolonged existence of unconnected signs of deviation in Emily's life reflected another parallel reality, where fragments of the past still lay dormant in the 1971 investigation files, not disappearing, but also not reactivated, as in the many years after the case was frozen. These documents were stored merely as evidence of a concluded effort, rather than living data for continued analysis. In those case files, information about the day Emily Adams disappeared, initial statements, witness descriptions, and investigator notes existed as disjointed slices of a picture, never completed, and precisely because there was no new progress for a long time, systematically reviewing these files almost never occurred proactively. If examined systematically, some details in the 1971 files revealed potential matches with the life Emily was living under a different identity, but at that time, there was no mechanism or motivation to perform such comparison, as the two realities were considered completely separate, one a missing child, presumed dead, the other, a legally existing individual in society, with complete records. Notable matching details lay in seemingly minor elements, such as age, timing of movement between areas, or administrative information, not fully aligning with norms, factors that if placed side by side, could suggest a connection, but when existing separately in different systems, lacked the power to generate suspicion on their own. In the 1971 files, some notes about the possibility that Emily had been taken out of the area very early, or about statements inconsistent with the main hypothesis, were recorded as secondary information, not developed further, because they did not fit the priority investigation direction, and these very notes, if re-examined in a different context, could take on entirely new meaning. The investigative significance of these buried details did not lie in directly pointing to Emily's current identity, but in breaking the assumption that all possibilities had been exhausted in the early 1970s, showing that some lines of reasoning were overlooked, not due to lack of logic, but due to lack of tools and context to connect them to the broader reality. The timing when these details were overlooked was tied to the phase of misdirected investigation, when resources and attention focused heavily on specific hypotheses, causing inconsistent information to be sidelined as noise, and once labeled as such, it was rarely revisited, especially in an investigation system under pressure to prioritize short-term efficiency. This overlooking was not the result of isolated carelessness, but the consequence of a chain of systemic decisions, where each step narrowing the investigation scope reduced the ability to see the potential value of outlier details, and over time, those details were buried under layers of provisional conclusions that had become truth in the files. For many years, the old files of the Emily Adams case existed in a static state, stored as part of the cold case archive, where their value depended entirely on the emergence of a new external factor, as no one proactively dug deeper to find new connections from what already existed. If placed in a modern context, comparing the 1971 files with other civil data could be done relatively quickly through digitization tools, but in the preceding decades, this was nearly impossible, causing potential matching details never to be placed side by side to form a larger question. Precisely the absence of cross-disciplinary and cross-system comparison turned these clues into buried pieces of history, existing but unseen, and over time, their value was further obscured by the passage of time and changes in social context. The deeper meaning of these matching details lay in showing that the truth about Emily being alive was not entirely invisible in the initial investigation files, but existed as untapped possibilities, overlooked not because they were wrong, but because they did not fit the reasoning structure dominating at the time. The overlooking of these details also reflected a common limitation of traditional investigations, where data was collected but could not be connected beyond the specific case scope, causing valuable clues to only realize meaning when placed in a broader context that the system at the time was not ready to provide. Over many years, the existence of these historical clues did not directly impact Emily's life, as they were isolated in a different system, but theoretically, they remained anchor points that could connect the two realities, if suitable conditions arose. The timing of their overlooking, in retrospect, was not a single moment, but an entire phase, where investigation priorities, social pressure, and technological limits simultaneously pushed the investigation along a certain trajectory, leaving other possibilities outside the view. Thus, buried historical clues are not just the story of what was missed, but evidence that truth sometimes does not disappear, but is merely misplaced in a picture not yet large enough to contain it. In Emily Adams's case, these details existed as passive traces, not strong enough to speak for themselves, but also not completely erased, awaiting a time when investigation context, technology, and thinking had changed enough to allow them to be reinterpreted with different meaning. The prolonged existence of these clues, though unused for decades, shows that the case's past was not completely sealed, but only covered by the system's silence, and within that silence, the matching details lay dormant, ready to become the bridge between a missing person case presumed, concluded, and a life that had continued beyond the sight of those who once searched for Emily Adams. The failure to reactivate buried historical clues led to a prolonged period in which time became the most dominant factor in the fate of the Emily Adams case, as each passing year not only further dimmed investigation possibilities, but also reshaped how those involved learned to live with uncertainty, turning a sudden event into a state lasting nearly half a century. Time in this case did not operate as a straight line, but as a slow compressive force, causing memories, emotions, and expectations to change across phases, from initial urgency to fragile hope, then gradually to cautious acceptance that answers might never come. For Emily's biological family, each year without news was not an empty year, but one marked by unanswered questions, where every life event was overshadowed by her absence, from holidays, birthdays, to milestones of maturity that Emily should have experienced. The family's waiting did not take the form of specific actions, but existed as a constant mental state, where hope no longer burned fiercely, but also did not fully extinguish, sustained by the possibility that truth, however faint, might still exist beyond their view. Across decades, the way the family coped with waiting also changed, from actively seeking information, maintaining contact with authorities, to gradually retreating into private life, carrying the pain as part of family identity, no longer widely shared, but never disappearing. The lack of a definitive conclusion forced the family to live in a suspended state between loss and hope, where believing Emily was dead provided a painful closure, but believing she was alive opened an endless waiting void, and both possibilities carried their own psychological burdens. Meanwhile, in a completely separate timeline, Emily continued living a normal life under the false identity, going through stages of maturity, making personal decisions, building relationships, and envisioning the future based on a foundation unrelated to the 1971 disappearance. As in her perception, the past held no mystery needing decoding. Emily living without knowing her true identity was not the result of active denial, but the consequence of a long process where everything around her confirmed the current story, making the existence of another identity unnecessary to explain any aspect of her life. Each passing year in Emily's life was not just a year of added experience, but also a year increasing the distance between the person she was becoming and the 4-year-old child who disappeared, as memories, not reinforced, gradually faded, and emotional connections, not reiterated, lost their ability to shape identity. The parallelism between these two realities, one, the biological family continuing to wait, the other Emily, living unaware she was being waited for, created a profound paradox, where the same person existed in two completely different stories, without intersection for decades. On the investigation systems side, intervention capability increasingly declined over time, not only due to lack of new evidence, but also due to changes in foundational elements, like personnel, procedures, and priorities, as initial investigators retired or passed away, taking informal case knowledge with them, leaving dry files, unable to fully convey the context and intuition that existed in the early phase. Each passing year also reduced the ability to reconstruct events, as details already vague from the start became harder to pinpoint, and cross-referencing old statements with the present yielded no new value without supplementary data for verification. Declining investigation capability also stemmed from initial hypotheses, though possibly incomplete, becoming fixed templates in the files, making re-examination from a completely different angle difficult without a strong enough trigger to break the long-established reasoning structure. In that context, the Emily Adams case gradually became viewed as part of local history, rather than an ongoing investigation awaiting resolution, mentioned on anniversaries or summaries, but no longer generating specific action momentum. Time also changed how society perceived the case, as new generations lacked direct memory of the event, and Emily's story became one case in the list of unresolved disappearances, more symbolic than urgent. For the biological family, prolonged waiting forced them to learn to move forward without answers, developing personal coping mechanisms to maintain daily life, while retaining a portion of spirit for the possibility of reunion, though that possibility grew increasingly remote in subjective feeling. For Emily, not knowing her true identity allowed her to live a life not defined by the tragedy of disappearance, but simultaneously caused her to unwittingly move further from her starting point. As each new relationship, each long-term decision was built on a foundation not fully reflecting personal history. The prolongation of the unresolved state, over 49 years, was thus not just the absence of answers, but an accumulation of consequences, where time both soothed the surface of pain and deepened the gap between what happened and what was perceived. Declining investigation capability was not a sudden event, but a slow downward curve, reflecting the combination of many factors, from technological limits, fading memories, to shifting system priorities, all simultaneously narrowing the space for truth to emerge. Over those 49 years, the Emily Adams case existed as a prolonged blind spot, where everything needed for resolution seemed to have vanished, but simultaneously accumulated enough historical depth that when a new factor appeared, if it appeared, it could create a turning point impact. Precisely the prolongation of this unresolved state turned Emily's story from a single disappearance into evidence of how time can both conceal and preserve truth, as while surface traces were erased, the truth itself remained somewhere, unchanged, awaiting suitable conditions to be seen. 49 years unresolved, viewed from outside, might be seen as system failure, but viewed from within the story, it was the period when two lives continued in parallel without intersecting, one the unanswered waiting of the biological family, the other Emily's normal life in ignorance, and precisely that parallelism was the core factor, allowing the case to last nearly half a century, without resolution, until entirely different conditions emerged to challenge the silence that had been maintained for too long. The nearly half-century silence surrounding the Emily Adams case was truly challenged only when a factor completely outside the traditional investigative orbit appeared, not from old files or witnesses whose memories had faded, but from the development of consumer DNA technology and the increasingly widespread popularity of voluntary testing services where millions of individuals participated to explore their genetic origins, family history, or simply out of curiosity about themselves. In that context, Emily, under the identity she had carried throughout her adult life, approached DNA testing as a personal activity unrelated to any criminal suspicion, because for her, the past remained a foggy area that demanded no resolution, and participating in the test was seen as a way to explore herself within a modern framework, without any expectation of changing the story of her identity. The DNA sample was sent off, processed, and entered into the genetic database alongside millions of others, where comparison algorithms searched for kinship matches based on the degree of shared genes, a process that occurred entirely automatically, without emotional factors or historical assumptions, and it was precisely this impartiality of the process that laid the foundation for the turning point about to occur. The initial results did not appear as a complete answer, but as an anomalous signal. When the system recorded genetic connections that did not align with the family story Emily had known for years, with match levels exceeding the threshold for distant relationships, but not compatible with the closest relationships in her current life. This discovery of abnormal kinship did not immediately lead to a specific conclusion, but it was clear enough that it could not be dismissed as a technical error, because the gene-sharing ratios were calculated based on rigorous probabilistic standards, where certain numbers could only appear in very specific biological relationship scenarios. The anomaly lay in the fact that these results suggested the existence of blood relatives not mentioned in the current family story, while simultaneously not recording genetic connections at levels appropriate for those Emily believed to be her closest blood relatives, creating a contradiction that could not be explained by ordinary assumptions. Confirmation of the initial results was carried out through technical cross-checking steps, including retesting the sample, comparing it with other datasets in the same system, and evaluating the consistency of genetic markers, to rule out processing errors or algorithmic mistakes. And with each verification step, the initial anomaly not only did not disappear but became clearer. The matching indicators continued to point to suggested blood relationships that could not be explained by scenarios, such as known legal adoption, distant relatives, or data discrepancies, because the degree of gene sharing exceeded those thresholds and fell within the range of direct or near-direct lineage. The emergence of these results placed Emily in a completely new position relative to everything she had ever believed about herself, because for the first time, questions about her identity no longer existed in a vague form or as a prolonged sense of misalignment, but were concretized by measurable, comparable, and independently verifiable scientific data. Importantly, DNA results do not depend on memory, testimony, or administrative records, but on genetic material that does not change over time, making them a form of evidence unaffected by fading or bias, and it was this characteristic that rendered the initial findings irreversible. When placed in the context of historical clues once buried in the 1971 files, even though the connection had not yet been made at this point, their potential significance became clearer, because for the first time in 49 years, a new factor appeared capable of breaking the separation between Emily's current life and the long-closed missing person case. Confirming the initial results was not just a technical step but a perceptual boundary, where the possibility of error was gradually eliminated, as alternative explanatory scenarios became increasingly narrow in the face of consistent genetic data. The determination that this was not a random coincidence was reinforced by the repeatability of the matching indicators, as multiple independent comparisons all led to the same conclusion about the degree of relationship, reducing the likelihood of a single erroneous result. In the context of modern science, such gene-sharing ratios can only occur when a specific blood relationship exists, and the fact that those relationships did not align with the current family story made the hypothesis of a concealed identity increasingly unavoidable. The fundamental difference between this turning point and all previous investigative efforts lay in the fact that DNA requires no assumptions or subjective interpretation because it inherently carries information about biological origin, making denial or postponement of confronting the results no longer rationally feasible. The determination that these results could not be mistaken did not stem from an emotional moment, but from a systematic elimination of other possibilities, where each alternative explanation was refuted by the data, leaving an increasingly clear scenario that the identity Emily had carried throughout her life did not fully reflect the truth about her origins. The DNA turning point thus not only opened a new direction for Emily personally, but also created a potential convergence point with the frozen case, because for the first time, a tool existed capable of connecting a living person to a cold case file, seemingly belonging to the past. In this moment, even without any official cross-referencing with the investigative system, the genetic data had done what decades of searching interrogations, and reasoning could not pose an unavoidable question about Emily's true identity, not based on memory or testimony, but on immutable genetic code, marking the moment when the 49-year silence was first broken by objective, independent evidence weighty enough to force all prior assumptions to be re-examined from the beginning. The groundbreaking DNA results did not close the story with an immediate conclusion, but opened a complex verification phase, where every assumption had to be tested through multiple independent layers to ensure that the connection suggested by the genetic data was not the product of a rare coincidence or hasty interpretation, and it was during this phase that cross-referencing with the Addams family began to be implemented cautiously, not based on emotional speculation, but on modern scientific and legal standards. DNA cross-referencing was conducted with genetic samples from individuals in direct blood relation to Emily Addams, according to the 1971 records, focusing on determining gene-sharing levels at key positions, where indicators could affirm or refute parent-child, or full sibling relationships with very high reliability, and the results of these comparisons showed compatibility, far exceeding the statistical threshold for random relationships, strongly reinforcing the hypothesis that the adult woman living under a different identity was indeed the 4-year-old child who had disappeared nearly half a century earlier. Alongside the DNA data, medical records were brought into the verification process to seek biological continuity between past and present, including cross-referencing blood type, rare genetic traits, physical markers recorded in early childhood, and stable medical characteristics that tend to persist throughout life. And although the initial medical records for Emily Addams from 1971 were incomplete due to storage limitations of that era, the remaining data still allowed for the establishment of important matching points with the adult woman's medical records, creating an additional independent confirmation layer, not dependent on DNA. The medical record review also focused on ruling out the possibility that the current identity only coincidentally matched genetically with the Addams family through distant relations, because the supplementary medical indicators, when placed side by side, showed a degree of compatibility exceeding what could be explained by non-direct kinship. In addition, educational records were scrutinized to reconstruct the timeline of Emily's development under the new identity, including enrollment milestones, school transfers, places of residence, and any gaps or anomalies in the records, not to seek evidence of fraudulent behavior, but to determine whether this timeline could reasonably fit with Emily being removed from Tennessee in 1971. The review process revealed that the educational milestones, though superficially seamless, still contained small gaps or details recorded later than usual, particularly in early childhood, consistent with the scenario of a child being entered into the education system under a new identity, without full prior records. Details once considered insignificant, now becoming important connecting points, when placed in the overall verification context. Combining educational data with medical records and DNA allowed for the construction of a multi-layered picture, where each information source alone was insufficient to confirm identity, but when layered together created a high degree of certainty, minimizing the risk of misinterpretation or premature conclusion. Throughout this process, a key objective was to rule out coincidence, because although rare, science acknowledges the existence of unexpected genetic matches in large populations, and therefore every alternative scenario, from unknown distant relatives to data noise, was included in the list for very in-depth statistical analyses were used to assess the probability of each scenario, and with each step, the possibility of random coincidence was narrowed as the genetic, medical, and administrative indicators simultaneously pointed to the same conclusion, creating a level of convergence that experts considered to surpass reasonable doubt. Ruling out coincidence was also reinforced by the consistency of data across multiple independent tests, as repeated results showed the same blood relationship pattern, regardless of using different analysis methods or cross-referencing separate datasets. What was crucial in this verification phase was the separation between emotion and data, because even as the results became clearer, the process still required maximum caution to avoid a historically significant conclusion being later challenged by any flaw in verification. The involvement of multiple experts from different fields, including genetics, medicine, and record analysis, helped ensure that every aspect of the identity was examined through the appropriate lens, minimizing the risk of overlooking or misinterpreting a critical detail. When all verification layers were completed, the overall picture emerged with unprecedented clarity. In the case's history, where DNA data provided the immutable biological foundation, medical records provided physical continuity, and educational records provided a compatible social timeline, while simultaneously ruling out the possibility that these matches were merely the result of randomness. This multi-layered verification process not only scientifically confirmed Emily's identity, but also served as a bridge between past and present, allowing a case once frozen in old files to be directly linked to a living person with a verifiable and reconstructible personal history. Successfully ruling out coincidence was pivotal, as it shifted the focus from the question, "Is it possible?" to what happened, marking the moment when Emily Adams's identity was no longer a hypothesis but a reality, confirmed by multiple independent data layers. In that context, the multi-layered identity verification not only completed a technical task, but also laid the groundwork for reconnecting the present individual with the forgotten cold case file, because for the first time in nearly 50 years, Emily Adams's existence was no longer a fragile possibility or emotional assumption, but a conclusion with solid scientific, legal, and administrative grounding, sufficient to force every old investigative structure of the case to be re-examined in the light of the newly confirmed truth. The multi-layered verification of Emily Adams's identity, through genetic, medical, and administrative data, created the necessary conditions for the case to cross the boundary from a historical file to a live investigation, thereby allowing the cold case unit to officially take over the matter in a context entirely different from 1971, when the goal was no longer searching for a child, presumed dead, but reconstructing the entire chain of events that led to a child being taken and living under a different identity for nearly half a century. This takeover was not formalistic, but accompanied by a re-evaluation of the legal and investigative value of the entire old file, because the previous conclusion of Emily's presumed death no longer aligned with the newly confirmed reality, forcing the system to readjust classification and prioritization. One of the cold case unit's first steps was to digitize the entire old file, converting paper documents, handwritten notes, crime scene photos, and investigative reports into digital format to enable quick access, search, and cross-referencing, a process reflecting the fundamental difference between modern investigative methods and the limitations of the earlier era. Digitization was not only for preservation, but also to unlock new analysis possibilities, as previously scattered data in separate physical folders could now be rearranged in multiple ways, allowing investigators to see connections that were previously unrecognizable due to the physical constraints of paper storage. Once digitized, the cold case unit proceeded to compare the old and new investigations, placing the hypotheses, conclusions, and decisions from the case's early years, alongside modern data and methods to determine not only what had been done, but also what had not been done, or could not be done at the time. This comparison revealed stark differences in investigative thinking, as 1971 investigators were constrained by the lack of identity verification tools, lack of interconnected databases, and pressure to reach quick conclusions amid the social and media context of that era, whereas modern investigators could approach the case with sufficient temporal distance to re-evaluate every assumption without similar urgent pressure. Placing the two approaches side by side highlighted points where the initial investigation had veered off course, not necessarily due to individual errors, but because systemic structures and foundational assumptions had guided the reasoning along a narrow path. The cold case unit focused on identifying initial systemic errors, such as prematurely dismissing the hypothesis that Emily was alive and possibly removed from the area, or not fully pursuing testimonies inconsistent with the main hypothesis, decisions once seen as reasonable within the constraints, but now recognized as critical breaking points in the investigative chain. Identifying errors was not aimed at assigning personal blame to prior investigators, but at understanding how initial assumptions had influenced every subsequent step, from resource allocation and evidence evaluation to how information was recorded and stored in the file. This review process also showed that some leads once discarded were not due to lack of intrinsic value, but because they could not be verified with the tools available at the time. And these same leads, when viewed in the light of DNA data and modern cross-referencing capabilities, began to take on new meaning. Reopening the file allowed the cold case unit to apply modern analytical methods to old data, from recreating detailed timelines to using relationship analysis software to examine interactions among witnesses, locations, and timings, an approach non-existent in the early 1970s. The comparison between old and new investigations also clarified time's role as a double-edged sword, as it had erased some physical evidence and direct witnesses while creating conditions for technological and investigative thinking to advance to the point of revisiting the case with entirely different questions. In that context, reopening the file was not merely continuing from where the case had stopped, but fully restructuring how the case was understood, starting with acknowledging that some prior conclusions were no longer valid and needed replacement with new assumptions aligned with confirmed reality. The cold case unit also cross-referenced how information was recorded in the old file against modern standards for storage and transparency, recognizing that many critical details had been scattered or incompletely documented, complicating event reconstruction, and thus part of the current work was reorganizing information to create a more coherent picture. Identifying initial errors also included evaluating how investigative decisions had affected the Adams family and community, as classifying Emily as deceased not only administratively closed the file, but shaped how society viewed the case for decades, reducing the likelihood of new information emerging from the public. Reopening the file thus carried responsibility, not only for historical truth, but also for the long-lasting consequences of prior decisions, requiring the cold case unit to approach the case with greater caution and comprehensiveness. Throughout this process, modern investigators continually questioned assumptions once taken for granted, from re-evaluating initial testimonies to considering whether overlooked leads could connect to the newly confirmed reality, an approach reflecting the fundamental shift in investigative thinking over time. Reopening the file also enabled integration of new data sources unavailable before, including civilian databases, travel records, and genetic information, creating a richer information network to support reconstruction. When comparing old and new investigations, the cold case unit recognized that the greatest difference lay not in effort level, but in the ability to ask the right questions, as questions posed in 1971 were limited by what the system allowed, whereas questions posed today were expanded by the very advances that had emerged over 49 years. Identifying initial errors thus carried no judgmental meaning, but was a necessary step to ensure the new investigation did not repeat old limitations. By proactively challenging assumptions and maximizing modern tools to approach the truth. At this point, reopening Emily Adams' cold case marked a clear shift from retrospection to action, where the case was no longer viewed as an unchangeable part of the past, but as an ongoing investigation with the specific goal of clarifying what happened in 1971, and why that truth could remain hidden for nearly half a century, laying the foundation for subsequent steps in the search for answers the system had once been unable to provide. The reopening and restructuring of the cold case file has led the investigation into a more sensitive phase, where the focus is no longer on who Emily Adams is, but on determining the responsibility of individuals and decisions that contributed to a chain of events spanning nearly half a century. This began with a comprehensive review of the entire list of old suspects considered in the early years after Emily's disappearance. These suspects, documented in the 1971 files with varying degrees of involvement, are now being re-evaluated in an entirely new context, as the foundational assumption that Emily had died no longer holds, forcing investigators to re-examine the motives, opportunities, and behaviors of each individual in light of the reality that a child had been taken and raised under a different identity. The review of old suspects does not proceed in a linear fashion, but through cross-referencing initial statements, scene notes, and previously dismissed clues with modern data, to determine whether anyone had access to Emily during the critical time window and the means to sustain long-term concealment. In this process, some suspects previously eliminated early because they did not fit the primary hypothesis are now being reconsidered, not to completely reverse prior conclusions, but to assess whether their elimination was based on objective data or influenced by the limited assumptions of that era. Alongside the individual review, the investigation also focuses on evaluating the possibility of legal accountability given the lengthy passage of time, a task requiring careful consideration of existing evidence, criminal proof standards, and current legal provisions. Accountability does not depend solely on identifying the original criminal act, but also on whether that act can be proven beyond a reasonable doubt, especially when much physical evidence is gone, and most data must be reconstructed from old records. Prosecutors involved in assessing the case must weigh whether the current evidence, though sufficient to confirm identity and reopen the file, is strong enough to support specific criminal charges, as prosecuting an old case with limited evidence always carries the risk of failing to achieve the desired legal outcome. The current legal status of involved individuals also becomes a key factor in the assessment, as after nearly 50 years, many on the old suspect list may have passed away, lost legal capacity, or no longer be fit to participate in proceedings, making the determination of responsibility more historical than capable of criminal processing. For those still alive, determining legal status requires careful examination of factors such as current residence, criminal history, and direct or indirect connection to the abduction and concealment, a complex process when much data is no longer complete. In addition, statutes of limitations play a pivotal role in shaping the scope of legal action, as many offenses related to the 1971 events may have exceeded the prosecution deadline under the laws of that time, creating an insurmountable legal barrier despite the historical truth being clarified. Evaluating statutes of limitations is not merely a technical procedure, but also an ethical and societal issue, where the question is not only whether prosecution is possible, but whether late prosecution would serve justice in the broader sense, given the consequences that have spanned decades. Investigators and legal experts must consider the possibility of applying exceptions or offenses without limitation periods, if any, while assessing whether related acts can be viewed under modern legal frameworks, a complex puzzle given how significantly laws have changed since 1971. In this process, reviewing old suspects also includes re-evaluating how those individuals were handled in the initial investigation, identifying any errors in collecting statements, assessing evidence, or ruling out involvement, factors that may affect determining responsibility in the present. Assessing prosecutability is thus not just a question of the present, but a reflection back on the past, forcing the system to confront decisions made under limited conditions and consider their consequences in light of new truth. For the Adams family and community, this phase carries the expectation that confirming Emily is alive could lead to clear accountability for what happened, but also faces the reality that criminal justice cannot always be fully enforced when too much time has passed, Within the investigation, determining statutes of limitations and the current legal status of suspects helps shape the next strategy, as it defines whether the goal is criminal prosecution, historical acknowledgement of responsibility, or simply clarifying the truth to close a long chapter of the case. This assessment also reveals that responsibility lies not only with individuals who may have directly participated in the abduction and concealment, but also with systemic factors that allowed the act to go undetected and unaddressed for so long, an aspect difficult to quantify legally, but impossible to ignore when viewing the entire case. The review of old suspects, assessment of prosecutability, and determination of limitation periods thus do not lead to a simple conclusion, but open a complex space where law, ethics, and history intersect, forcing the system to acknowledge that in some cases criminal justice cannot be fully achieved, even when the truth has been illuminated. In that context, the phase of assessing responsibility in suspects aims not only to identify who might be prosecutable, but also to determine society's level of understanding of what happened, laying the foundation for how the case will be remembered and handled in the present, as the focus gradually shifts from prosecution to recognition, repair, and learning from a chain of errors and limitations that allowed a child to disappear and live under a different identity for nearly half a century, undetected. The legal assessments of responsibility and prosecution limits close a complex chapter of the case, and simultaneously open the necessary path to the final step of identity confirmation, where all data verified at various levels is synthesized into an official legal conclusion, confirming that the adult woman, living under a different identity, is indeed Emily Adams, the 4-year-old child who disappeared in Tennessee in 1971. The process of completing legal confirmation does not occur in a single moment, but as the result of synchronized cross-verification between DNA conclusions, medical analyses, educational records, and administrative evaluations, all presented and reviewed according to modern standards, to ensure the final conclusion is not only scientifically correct, but legally solid. This confirmation triggers official changes in the system, from updating civil records to adjusting the case status in investigative databases, marking the end of the period when Emily existed as an unsolved cold case, and the beginning of a new reality, where her true identity is officially recognized. Once the confirmation process is complete, the next step, one of special sensitivity, is notifying the biological family, a task carried out with utmost caution, because after nearly half a century of waiting, the news that Emily is alive is not only surprising but capable of upending emotional structures built to cope with prolonged loss. Notification is not simply conveying a fact, but a process of psychological preparation, where involved parties are supported to receive the information in a way that minimizes shock and facilitates processing the complex emotions that may arise. For the Adams family, this information shatters the decades-long state of ambiguous waiting, replacing it with a reality that is both liberating and filled with new questions, as Emily's existence does not erase the lost years, but places them in a different frame of meaning. When the first meeting is arranged, it is not treated as a simple symbolic reunion moment, but as an event requiring careful management, because both sides enter the encounter with entirely different experiences, memories, and expectations shaped by 49 years lived in two separate worlds. The meeting, after decades, does not follow the familiar emotional script of quick reunions, but is a slow process where recognition occurs, not just formally, but needs time to be internalized, as every glance and gesture must bridge the gap created by time. For Emily, facing her biological family is not simply reuniting with relatives, but confronting a part of her past that never existed in her awareness, forcing her to restructure her understanding of herself and her personal history. For the Adams family, seeing Emily as an adult brings both joy and pain, as her current image confirms the child they lost survived. yet reminds them they were absent for most of her life, an emotional contradiction not easily resolved in a single moment. The first meeting thus does not serve as an ending, but as the starting point of a longer process where the parties must learn to build a new relationship based on present reality, rather than trying to restore one interrupted when Emily was only 4. Establishing the new relationship happens, step by step, not based on the expectation that biological ties will automatically translate into emotional closeness, but on respecting each individual's pace and boundaries, especially for Emily, who must simultaneously reconcile two identities within herself. Initial interactions focus on creating a safe space to share information, memories and emotions, not to immediately fill the 49-year voids, but to allow the parties to gradually adjust to the reality that they are now present in each other's lives in an entirely new way. Legally and administratively, identity confirmation also triggers specific adjustments, from updating documents to resolving personal record issues, but these changes reflect only a small part of the deeper transformation occurring at the personal and family level. For Emily, having her true identity recognized does not erase the life she has lived, but places it in connection with a broader history, forcing her to find ways to reconcile what she knew with what has just been discovered, a process that can be lengthy and non-linear. For the Addams family, reunion does not mean turning back time, but learning to accept a new reality, where Emily is no longer the 4-year-old in their memories, but an adult with her own life, experiences, and choices. Building the new relationship thus relies not on trying to recreate what was lost, but on finding common ground in the present, allowing each side to be present as the person they are now, rather than the person they were in the other's memory. In this process, moments of connection emerge, not according to a predetermined script, but through small interactions, cautious conversations, and necessary silences for each side to process their emotions. The reunion, viewed from the outside, may be seen as the positive ending of a case spanning nearly half a century. But for those involved, it is the beginning of a new highly complex phase, where joy, pain, relief, and loss coexist. Identity confirmation and reunion are thus not the stopping point of the story, but the turning point, shifting the focus from seeking truth to learning to live with that truth, in a context where every relationship must be redefined to fit the present. At this point, the Emily Addams case no longer exists as an unsolved file, but as a reality clarified in terms of identity, opening space for the involved parties to continue their individual journeys, carrying both unanswered questions and new possibilities created by two parallel worlds, finally intersecting, after 49 years of separation. The reunion and identity confirmation of Emily Addams close the most important part of the journey to find the truth, but as the initial emotions subside, the legal reality of the case reveals an unavoidable limitation: the inability to criminally prosecute the acts that occurred in 1971, as nearly half a century has created legal barriers that cannot be overcome, despite the historical truth being clarified. The inability to prosecute does not stem from a lack of confidence in the new investigative conclusions, but from the fact that many individuals directly involved in the abduction and concealment have died, lost legal capacity, or cannot be prosecuted due to expired statutes of limitations under the laws applicable at the time of the incident, preventing criminal justice from being fully enforced. Prosecutors and investigative agencies must confront a familiar paradox in late-solved cold cases where the truth is finally confirmed, yet simultaneously highlights that the legal system is not designed to handle acts whose responsibility boundaries have been blurred by time, especially given how significantly laws have changed since the early 1970s. Although criminal charges cannot be filed, completing the investigation and confirming identity allows the Emily Addams file to be officially marked, solved, an administrative term, carrying multiple layers of meaning, as it reflects that the core question of the case has been answered, even though the legal consequences of that answer cannot be fully implemented. Marking the file solved does not mean every aspect of the case is closed, but only confirms that the decades-long uncertainty has ended, replaced by an officially recognized truth. Though that truth does not lead to traditional enforcement of justice, the limitations of the legal system in this case become clear when contrasted with the capabilities of modern science, as while DNA technology can trace biological connections after decades, the law remains bound by principles of limitation periods, proof standards, and procedural rights designed to ensure fairness in ordinary contexts, but become barriers when facing historical cases. This difference highlights a gap between knowing the truth and being able to act on it, a gap that cannot be filled solely by investigative effort or societal consensus. For Emily, the inability to criminally prosecute creates a sense of contradiction, as having her true identity recognized brings clarity and closes part of her personal story, but also leaves a void regarding accountability, as what happened to her in her first 4 years is not placed within a clear legal responsibility framework. For the Addams family, imperfect justice manifests in receiving answers about Emily's fate, but being unable to witness those responsible being brought before the law, a reality, forcing them to adjust expectations of fairness after years of waiting. The file being marked solved provides a symbolic form of closure, but also underscores that this closure does not erase the accumulated losses over time, as 49 years cannot be restored by any administrative decision. The limitations of the legal system also affect how society views the case, forcing the public to confront the reality that not every crime can be fully addressed if too much time has passed, even if the truth can eventually be uncovered through scientific progress. In this context, the Emily Addams case becomes a typical example of the disparity between investigative capability and prosecutorial ability, showing that legal justice and moral justice do not always align. The long-term impact of imperfect justice extends to all involved parties, from Emily, who must learn to live with the truth that her past cannot be repaired by law, to the Addams family, who must reshape their family narrative to include both reunion and irreversible loss. For investigative agencies and the legal system, the case raises profound questions about handling future cold cases, particularly balancing the pursuit of truth with managing expectations of legal accountability. When time has created insurmountable limits, the long-term impact is also evident in the case becoming part of collective memory, where it is remembered not only as a rare reunion story, but as a reminder of what can be missed when investigative and legal systems lack the tools to handle complex situations at the time they occur. For Emily, continuing to live after identity confirmation means carrying both realities, a life lived and a life lost, without any legal judgment, clearly defining the boundary between victim and perpetrator in the traditional sense. For the Addams family, imperfect justice forces them to redefine closure themselves, shifting from hoping for a verdict to seeking peace in the recognized truth. On a broader scale, the case shows that the legal system, though built to protect fairness, has inherent limits when facing time, and those limits cannot be fully overcome by technological progress or human goodwill. Marking the file solved thus has two sides, one ending the state of uncertainty, the other acknowledging that justice, in this case, can only be achieved at the level of awareness and recognition, not fully implemented at the criminal level. The long-term impact of this lies not only in the specific outcome of the case, but in how it shapes the involved parties' perception of justice, responsibility, and systemic limits, forcing them to seek meaning and closure in spaces beyond the law. In the intersection between confirmed truth and imperfect justice, the Emily Adams case leaves a complex mark, where relief at knowing the truth coexists with regret over the inability to prosecute, reflecting the reality that some stories, though resolved in terms of data, cannot be fully closed within the legal framework, and that very imperfection becomes an inseparable part of the legacy the case leaves for those involved, and for the system that was once powerless before it, for nearly half a century. Accepting that criminal justice cannot be fully enforced has placed the Emily Adams case in its final state, no longer the suspension of suspicion or the silence of a cold file, but a complete conclusion, in terms of truth, where the victim's identity has been confirmed, the core chain of events clarified, and the case officially recorded as solved, even though it cannot be closed in the traditional mold of a criminal conviction. In this state, the case no longer exists as an open question about the fate of a missing child, but as a complete historical file, reflecting both what happened and what the system could not do over nearly half a century, a result that is both resolving and reflective. The role of DNA technology emerges as the decisive factor throughout this journey, not because it replaced traditional investigative methods, but because it opened an entirely new path to truth, overcoming the limits imposed by time, memory, and paper records. Unlike physical clues or witness statements that easily erode, genetic data exists as a stable form of evidence, unchanged by years, enabling the reconnection of pieces separated by time in a way no prior tool could achieve. In Emily Adams's case, DNA technology served not only as a means of confirmation, but as a catalyst breaking the long-frozen state, forcing the investigative system to revisit old assumptions and completely restructure its understanding of the case. The significance of this turning point extends beyond one individual case, as it shows that seemingly unsolvable cold cases can still be reapproached when technology and investigative thinking evolve, opening the possibility that truth does not disappear, but only awaits the right conditions to be discovered. For similar cold cases, the Emily Adams case becomes clear evidence of the potential of combining civilian data, modern science, and persistent investigation, showing that files once closed should not be seen as absolute endings, but as temporary states within a given technological context. The role of DNA in this context also raises new questions about how society and the legal system manage genetic data, as while it enables solving old cases, it also requires careful consideration of privacy, consent, and responsible use. This case shows that when used for the right purpose, and within appropriate legal frameworks, DNA technology can become a powerful tool serving justice in the broader sense, even when criminal justice cannot be fully enforced. The case's significance for other cold cases also lies in highlighting the importance of preserving records, as without the initial documents, however imperfect, later cross-verification and reconstruction would be impossible, showing that every note and report, however seemingly unimportant when created, can become a critical link in the future. From a long-term investigative perspective, the Emily Adams case provides important lessons about how initial assumptions can shape an entire investigative trajectory, and how narrowing the scope too early, though reasonable in limited contexts, can lead to missing possibilities beyond the horizon. This lesson is not meant to judge those involved in the original investigation, but to emphasize that the system needs to be designed to allow re-examination of assumptions over time, especially as context and tools change. The case also shows that classifying a victim as deceased without conclusive evidence may offer short-term administrative efficiency, but can also close important doors to discovering the truth later. A valuable lesson for how authorities handle long-term missing persons cases. From a human perspective, the final state of the case is not just a conclusion within the system, but a new reality for Emily and the Adams family, where the truth is recognized but irreversible losses remain, reminding us that solving a case does not mean erasing the consequences it left in the lives of those involved. The case also highlights the difference between solving in the investigative sense and closing in the emotional sense, showing that the two concepts do not always align, and the legal system can only play a certain role in the long-term healing process of individuals, for the community, and broader society. Emily Adams' story becomes a reminder that missing persons cases are not isolated events, but ongoing stories whose consequences ripple across generations and cannot be measured solely by years in a file. The role of DNA technology in reconnecting these stories also shows that scientific progress can offer opportunities to partially repair past injustices, though not completely erase them. Long-term investigative lessons drawn from the case emphasize the importance of flexibility, maintaining the ability to re-ask questions, and not viewing any conclusion as permanent without irrefutable evidence, a principle especially critical in cases involving missing children. The Emily Adams case also demonstrates the value of cross-disciplinary coordination, where science, investigation, and law need to be connected to create a comprehensive picture rather than operating in separate silos as often happened in the past. In its final state, the case is not only recorded as solved but becomes a reference example for how cold cases can be systematically, humanly, and evidence-based reapproached, even when legal outcomes cannot meet every expectation. The case's existence in collective memory thus does not stop at being solved, but in how it continues to influence investigative thinking, policy, and societal awareness of missing children and the persistence of truth after decades. Ultimately, summarizing the Emily Adams case is not merely closing a file, but acknowledging that justice, truth, and time have a complex relationship, where truth can be found very late. Justice may never be perfect, but continuing to search and learn from past mistakes still holds profound meaning, as every case solved, no matter how late, opens the opportunity for the system to do better for similar cases in the future, and that very meaning makes Emily Adams' story transcend the personal to become a long-term lesson in investigation, technology, and societal responsibility. Emily Adams' story offers a very real-world lesson for America today. Safety is no longer just a feeling, but a system of habits. In 1971 Chattanooga, the community trusted each other to the point that just a few minutes, Emily out of sight, was enough for a stranger to disrupt a peaceful routine. The key witness briefly suspected something, then reassured themselves, and that moment of hesitation, not locking the door, not checking again immediately, not calling for help, became the decisive gap. In modern America, we have doorbell cameras, GPS tracking, Amber alerts, but the lesson remains the same. When there's an out-of-place detail, a stranger lingering in the yard, an unfamiliar car parked too long, someone asking a child questions in an inappropriate way, trust your instinct, and follow the family's pre-agreed protocol. Call another adult, bring the child inside, note the license plate, call 911 immediately if there's risk. The story also reminds us that paperwork and data matter as much as locked doors. Emily grew up under a different identity because of administrative gaps in the pre-strict SSN era. Today, parents should keep copies of birth certificates, medical records, updated photos, and teach children age-appropriate basic information: name, phone number, address. Finally, the 2020 DNA breakthrough shows the power of technology, but also a warning. If a family has a missing person, proactively preserve records, update DNA when possible, and cooperate with cold case units, because solved sometimes comes late, but preparation can shorten the path from doubt to truth. If Emily Adams' story has made you reflect on what can be missed and the value of truth, even when it arrives very late,
Please subscribe to the channel so we can continue following other cold cases that have been and are being revealed. Thank you for staying with us to the end of this story, and see you in the next video, where every file is not just a case, but a life waiting to be told again.